There are 7 stages a killer goes through to become a serial killer. And these phases are typically very different, and they're used to profile serial killers versus murderers, because most murderers, they will kill from emotions that probably you and I not understand, because it's not like we're justifying their actions. But these are emotions that most people feel, just not to the point of being homicidal. You feel angry at times. You feel jealous, fear, these types of things. But for serial killers, they kill for the thrill. And there's just no way that we can even try to grasp that, like try to wrap our heads around something like that. They live their lives so that they can take lives. That's it. The first phase is the aura phase. This is when the killer starts to create this aura around him, this almost border, distance themselves from social relationships and people. They start pulling away from family and friends. They retreat into their own little fantasy world, where they start having, in most cases, very violent thoughts. And there's nobody around them for them to confide in, to tell them, hey, you think this is weird? No one. They're alone. Louis was never allowed to have friends, so that wasn't really a thing. He was never close with his family, and after his continuous assaults by family, friends, and priests, he's already fantasizing about turning the tables and returning the pain that he felt to a random innocent boy. That is his fantasy. The second phase is the trolling phase. That's what it's called. And it usually consists of the killer kind of toying with the idea of killing a little bit more. Instead of just having fantasies, they start thinking of, well, what would the process look like? And who would it be? And how would I really go about it? They're not sitting there taking notes and coming up with a full plan. Not yet. That's a different phase. But they're kind of thinking a little bit more realistic. How am I going to implement this into my life? Louis was the oldest of 7 kids. And one day, like a drill sergeant, he's lining up his little siblings. He's yelling, get in line, get in line. Males and female siblings, okay? They're really young. Louis himself is only 15 years old. He forces them to line up, strip down of all their clothes, and from there, he goes one by one, slowly caressing them. He describes it as, and I quote, a light, smooth touch. Just like tracing his hands on them. He claimed that's all he did. Other sources claimed he would take it a step further and force his siblings to sleep unclothed in the same bed as him, and when they were asleep, he would touch them. But we are unsure. Now we enter into the third phase. This is kind of the flirting phase. There's a slight difference between the trolling phase and the flirting phase. I don't think the flirting phase is a great way to label it, but I'm not the one that came up with these labels. It's when a serial killer is in this hyper-focused mode of trying to find the perfect victim, trying to kind of flirt with the victim, gain their trust, toy with the idea of how and where to kill that particular victim. So they're narrowing it down to a group of people that they want to target. More concrete plans are being made in this phase. They're literally flirting with the idea of killing, which is terrifying to think about.
Who came out with these 7 steps?
A bunch of profilers.
Oh,
yeah.
I see.
But what's interesting? A lot of different serial killer profilers have different methods. Yeah, there's a couple of things that they all go by. I saw that some people don't use these 7 stages. Some people do. So I guess it really depends, right? Now, Louis is in his 20s. And you would never in a million years think that this man is flirting with the idea of becoming a serial killer if you met him. He's working at a bakery. He's baking loaves of bread. He goes to church every single Sunday. He even attended AA meetings to address his relationship with alcohol. Middle-aged women would come down into the bakery, buy a loaf of bread, and shove pictures of their daughter in Louis's face. And they knew that he was an alcoholic, but a lot of men in this town were. At least Louis is working on it. He acknowledged it, and he looks kind of cute. He wears those 80s style big eyeglasses. And I'm not saying that to compliment him. I'm saying, this is the older lady's perspective. He's baking cakes for a living. He goes to church on the weekends. He does occasionally get very angry with the bakery owners, so his bosses, and he would occasionally punch them in the face a couple of times. But other than that, he was a complete catch. A lot of these moms, I'm sure they didn't see him punch his bosses. The moms, they would already have 2 loaves of bread at home, but they were just stopping by to buy another loaf, begging Louis, hey, my daughter is single. Louis would politely decline, and he said, maybe later. I've got a lot on my mind right now. Louis had started assaulting little boys in the park. Now, he would hide in the bushes with his machete, and if he saw a little kid walk by alone, he would jump out and yell, don't say anything or I'll kill you. One of his earlier victims, William Trujillo, he said that Lewis forced him out of his clothes and did everything to him, everything including torture, biting him painfully all over. But he said the worst part was that he was so silent doing everything. Like completely silent. It was terrifying and disturbing. And his stench, William said, "Do you know what a farm worker smells like after a day of work? That's what he smelled like." William was tortured and held captive in that park for 12 hours. And even in his earlier crimes, it's clear Lewis likes the mental torture aspect of all of this, because William remembers finally gaining the courage to talk, and he asked, "Sir, when will you be letting me go home?" And there was silence. And finally Lewis spoke and said, "When the bells ring." The church bells ring at 5 a.m. He had already been there for like 10 hours. William had to wait for what feels like an eternity, and he didn't even know if the man was telling him the truth or he was lying to him. And right at 5, the church bells go off. Lewis slowly releases his grip and says, "Go ahead." And William books it. He runs off. The fourth phase that serial killers typically take is the capturing phase. And Lewis was capturing a ton of children. About 200 children were captured by Lewis, brutally assaulted, and ultimately released. So these 200 children are not even his murder victims. So just think about the sheer amount of victims that he has in his lifetime.
Wow.
Now, quick disclaimer, I don't feel like we need to, because everyone here are reasonable, intelligent people, but Lewis is a male killer who targeted boys. And if that makes anyone think that there is a link between being gay or bisexual and being a serial killer, there should be some, I don't know, critical thinking comprehension classes out there that should probably urgently be looked into. So this has nothing to do with sexuality. I do see a lot of people kind of point out the link between the extreme Catholicism that he was raised in, where homosexuality was like a cardinal sin, and then him being assaulted as a kid and then developing these attractions towards a certain gender. I don't know. I feel like a killer is a killer, you know? And we can kind of argue these things, but at what point is it just... Now, Lewis would go to the park with candy, drinks, toys, whatever he thought he could entice little boys with, and he would wait for these boys to walk by. Sometimes he would use candy to be like, "Come here, you want some candy?" Literally. That's what he would do. He would lure them with candy. He would then string them along to a secluded area of the park, tie them up, and torture them. A lot of experts believe that he was experimenting with torture since his essays as a kid involved a lot of physical pain. So he started cutting victims with razors, shallow cuts all over their bodies. Then he tried deeper cuts, but he didn't really like that. So he just did shallow cuts. So this would go on for 12 hours at a time. He very quickly learned he had to be mindful that his torture tactics didn't kill the victims, because he wanted his victims alive, because that's the whole fun of it. He brought candles into the park. He would light them on fire to burn his victims, just like he had been burned as a kid. He would bite the victims all over their bodies, beat them, and he would pummel his victims, a full-grown adult targeting 5-year-olds, and he would assault them. Lewis was disorganized, yet organized. He was very disorganized in almost all other aspects of the crime, but when it came to the torture, he was very methodical. The torture almost always happened in the same order every single time. It's like he had created the perfect cycle to maximize his sick pleasure. And when he was done, he would let them go, rush home to write their names down in this little blue book of his. And this is the part that just really makes this case an anomaly. But for 12 years, Lewis was in this phase, toying with the idea of murdering for 12 years, essaying hundreds of kids, torturing them, hundreds of them. And I say anomaly not just because he was in this phase for 12 years, but also the fact that he wasn't put behind bars before he committed his first murder, when he is out there committing some of the most atrocious crimes that we've researched, is just crazy. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I also do really want to disclaim, we really wish that we could share more of who the victims were, what they were like, but unfortunately, there just aren't that many stories of Lewis's victims out there. I was provided some context by our researchers, and they stated, when a boy went missing in Colombia at the time, the most likely reason was either being a victim of a gang, cartel, or a paramilitary group, or maybe they left home due to extreme domestic violence from the parents. most parents did not file missing persons reports because a lot of them were just straight up scared. If we went to the police, and most police forces are run by cartels, and the cartel took our kid, we report it to the police who the cartel controls, then our child would be in even more danger. What if they think that our child snitched or we're causing too much trouble to keep the child alive? As for Lewis's assault victims, even if they came home and told their parents what had happened, parents felt like going to the authorities was just not an option. Not only was justice rarely ever served for cases like this, their child is now going to be subject to life-threatening social shame. And all for what? To not get justice? And just victimize their kid even further? A lot of Lewis's victims are still not identified to this day. And now that's both his assault victims and later his murder victims. After 12 years, he would escalate into phase 5, murder.